Hey, it's Matt O'Leary, and it's time for a review of the album Acid Star by a new band to me called Peel. This is their debut album, and it's some psychedelic pop, in light of this news that Kevin Parker has apparently sold his entire music catalog to Sony, like both past and future. All is calm when you're closer, the panic is over. Last year, I did a video on my top 10 psychedelic pop albums of the 2010s, which I feel like was a very fertile decade for that style of music. Neo-psych really dominated the alternative rock market, but psych pop is a sound that is largely faded from relevance, as I feel like most of these acts have ended up sounding like Tame Impala copycats, drawing directly from a faded trend instead of innovating and making old sounds modern through great songwriting, which I feel like is what the Tame Impala cohort largely did. Personally, I never gave up on this sound or style, as I always welcome clever melodies, clever chord progressions in really whatever style they appear. And this album just caught my attention right away. I think it could be one of the best entries in this style of the 2020s so far. So let's get into it. Let's peel it back, if you will, and learn what makes this album tick. The band Peel, this Los Angeles duo, is Sean Cimino and Isom Innis. They're both ex-touring members of the band Foster the People, turning what became indie pop pablum into something much more compositionally clever with Peel. There's still a little bit of this kind of mall music, indie pop sort of vibe going on here, but better. Obviously, I put a heavy emphasis on Tame Impala and that kind of sound here. If you're looking for the sugar high of an album like Currents, then yeah, there is some of that here. Like OMG, which uses the time-tested low-pass filter effect on the first four measures to set up this glorious beat drop with some swirling trebles and rumbling synth bass. I love that slow tom fill that really becomes a signature part of the track. I love when drums are used with repetition so that it becomes a recognizable part of the composition rather than just a way to transition and fill space. Then there's the extremely catchy Cycles, which is probably the most Impala-esque with those bubbly high bass lines and super, super compressed drums. And of course, you got that dreamy falsetto hook. Delicious. The track Pavement is like old MGMT meets Temples with that Baroque harpsichord touch, and this very Temples-esque anthemic chorus that channels James Bagshaw pretty directly with the vocal tone very nasally. If you told me this was the new Temples single, I probably would be fooled. So, Temples, Tame Impala, MGMT, the old guard, if you will. And while those few tracks do feel eerily familiar and maybe a little derivative if they weren't so well written, there are other sounds going on here. I don't want to pigeonhole it. I love the skittering off-kilter bass lines of Climax, which is really like Talking Heads meets the Strokes, or Manic World, which is much more slow, much more spacious, just sunbaking you with these waves of sound rather than these skittering riffs. There's also kind of this chill wave thing going on, like a more modern, George Clanton or Tori Moi on tracks like Molgoth or In the Sedentary. Honestly, some of my least favorite tracks on the album, but they do make for a pretty diverse listening experience. With a few of these just straight up electronic passages that do sound a tad generic compared to the rest of the stuff here, like In the Sedentary, Molgoth. These songs sound like they could be on the FIFA soundtrack. The title track, though, is really when I became a believer in Peel. A refreshing acoustic cut that reaches the heavens with this hook that fittingly speaks of something very ephemeral. The band thinks of Acid Star like a rock god or something, an ideal, something of the utmost importance. This one reminds me of like a Stupid Dream era Porcupine Tree. Like it's definitely got that 90s Steven Wilson kind of thing going on. The Closer the Cloak is another slow, reverbed acoustic ballad with this Hofner sounding bass thump, still with a nice chill wave nod that gives it a more modern sound. This whole record is like this collage of nostalgic sounds that really spans the decades. So if you dive in here and you're turned off by the first track or any aspect of it, do give the full thing a listen. It's a pretty easy listen, but it's not super cohesive or conceptual in its vision, which, when looked at one way, is probably its biggest weakness. But I need albums like this. It reminds me of like a Pond or a Yeasayer. Their vision, their scope of what they're doing isn't earth-shattering, but it's extremely likable. And again, just super strong songwriting from front to back on this thing. I haven't heard it talked about like at all, so I wanted to just share it your way. Let me know what you think of it. Of course, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And as always, thank you so much for watching.